Today we have Lamentations, okay? And a quiz question for you. Lamentations of whom?
Jeremiah.
Jeremiah. Yeah, very easy. I mean, it's kind of difficult question for those who read like Russian Bible, because in Russian Bible it says Lamentations of Jeremiah. That's the full name. But in English Bible, for whatever reason, they skipped the name of the guy, and actually his name is not mentioned in the book. Therefore, modern critical theology, of course, raised the question when the book was written. It's it's not Jeremiah. Make sure that we will not believe in the Bible. Yes. But in reality, I think the song of, take the term song somewhat loosely, but it's well organized. We'll talk about this in a second. Okay? Song of this kind of intensity, I believe, can be written only right after of this event. Okay? Because even if you think about the destruction, you go back with your memories, the further you go, in a sense, the softer the pain is, the emotions got kind of tuned down. People get more into like a philosophical mood. We think about the reasons. We think about what could have went different, but not necessarily of that particular explanation. And he picks up so many themes. Therefore, it's a Jeremiah, I think, kind of like Jesus, and I wrote that parallel down in the notes. We'll come back to that. Kind of like Jesus sitting on the hill of Olive Mountains, looking down at Jerusalem, saying, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how many times I wanted to gather your little ones as what's that? The chick that gathers her little chicken, under the wings, but you did not want it, and then this moment comes, and destruction is made. There is another thing which really connects this book with Jeremiah. Apart from wars and all of that, again, let's go back to the book of Jeremiah that we talked about, 2 weeks ago? He was prophesying for about 50 years the very same message. You need to surrender to God, and you surrender to God. The fact that you are surrendering to God is seen in the fact that you surrender to Nebuchadnezzar. If you will surrender, you will survive. You will go through that much more smoothly than if you will not. And they did not. They called him a traitor, many other unpleasant names. He ended up in the prison for X number of times, and now it finally happens. The city is destroyed. The city is lonely on the hill, that's how the book begins, but the temple is destroyed. So, in Hebrew, the book is called Aha, which stands for the first word, which is how. How lonely sits the city that was full of people, and how, like a widow, has she become, she who was great among the nations. So this how question is not necessarily the question of management, like how did it happen? Let's list 5 steps how it happened. No, it's more of emotional raising of the voice. How bad is that? Now, speaking about the structure, and I said it's kind of like a song. We have 5 chapters, as you can see. Okay. Interestingly enough, all 5 chapters in the book of Lamentations have a number of verses that's somewhat related to number 22. Okay? Yes, right? I mean, some of you look puzzled. Because, I don't know, in my Bible, it's all related to 22. In chapter 1, we have 22 verses. In chapter 2, we have 22 verses. In chapter 3, we have 66 verses, which is, it's 3 times 22. Correct. And then in chapter 4, we have 22 verses. And then in chapter 5, we have 22 verses. Okay? Why is this important? It is important not only because of the number, but whenever you see in the Bible 22, it refers, and especially in the Old Testament, it always refers, one way or another, to Hebrew alphabet.
Oh.
Why? Because they have 22 letters. Okay? Very simple. But, along with that, chapter 1 is an alphabetical acrostic. Everybody knows what the acrostic is? Okay? That's when you have a poem written, but the first letter either turns into a phrase or a word. In this particular case, it's alphabetical. So the first verse begins with Aleph, with the first letter of alphabet. Second verse begins with Beth, with second letter of alphabet. Third verse begins with Gimel, with the third letter of Hebrew alphabet. And so on and so forth. So chapter 1, with the beginning of the verses, goes through the whole alphabet. Okay? Now, chapter 2 also goes through the whole alphabet. Again, we have Aleph, Beth, Gimel, Daleth, Heth, Vav, Zayin, Het, Tet, so on and so forth. You all know that. I'm not going to repeat the Hebrew alphabet for you. Okay? Now, with 66 verses, it's even more fun. Why? Because they brought it into the blocks of 3. Jeremiah was such a skillful writer, and he did. Verses 1, 2, and 3, they begin with Aleph. Then verses 4, 5, and 6 begin with Beth, with second letter of alphabet. Then verses 7, 8, and 9 begin with Gimel, which is third letter of alphabet. Then, of course, verses, what is that? I'm kind of lost. 10, 11, and 12 begin with Daleth, with the fourth, and so on and so forth. So it's very well structured. Then we come to chapter 4. It is almost a complete sequence of alphabetical letters in the beginning of the verse. 2 of them are actually switched toward the end. And then in chapter 5, we have 22 verses that still remind us of Hebrew alphabet, but we do not have a sequence. Okay? So there are a few ideas why we have structure of the book the way we have it. One of the ideas, of course, since Jeremiah is not the author, it was composed later on in history by putting together different poems. Okay? There was one skillful writer, and he wrote beginning and first 2 or first 3 chapters, and then there was a less skillful poet, and he wrote the end. And some kind of very unskillful editor had no brain to put them together into one song. Okay? There is a theory. I'm serious. If you will pick up a commentary on Lamentation, you might see it in introduction. Okay? I don't believe it. I don't agree with that. I don't think so. There is another idea. Again, we have not different ones, but we have less skillful poet than Jeremiah himself, because we know that Jeremiah was somewhat skillful poet from the book of Jeremiah, unless you believe the book of Jeremiah is by Jeremiah. Okay, that's kind of mess up brain that goes on back into historical critical perception. If you believe the book of Jeremiah is by Jeremiah, but still do not necessarily attach book of Jeremiah to the Lamentations, people say that it was one author, but he kind of ran out of his, I don't know, what's the ideas, thank you. Or, he was not in the mood by the end of the book. Okay? So he was skillful enough to provide the first and second and third, which is the top, of course, and then slowly but surely his inspiration ran out. I don't know. I understand that people believe in inspiration being moved by the spirits. So when you run out of wine, you kind of run out of inspiration. If that's your idea of inspiration, that's fine. But I don't think so. So that's an idea number 2. There is idea number 3, and I kind of tend to hold that thing. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and then God says, "Let there be light." Everything as we know it is created by the Word of God. Okay? And that's why John in his gospel begins. In the beginning was the Word. Okay? To make the words, you need to have alphabet. So when you have a complete alphabet, it's kinda a basic structure, basic foundation for all the all the words, let's make a pun out of that, all the words out in the world, okay? So the alphabet of God means the full immersion or full immanence, the full influence of God as the Word of God in the world. So God presented himself as a destructive God who will fulfill his promises if people of Jerusalem will not be faithful. That's why he presents himself as a full alphabet in chapter 1 and in chapter 2, and then very well developed alphabet in chapter 3. But beginning with chapter 4, we see that the judgmental Word of God turns into something less judgmental. It's less ordered. So the judgment of God turns into mercy of God, and that's why we do have a reminder of the alphabet, but we do not have alphabet itself. Okay? Is that kind of easy to understand? So we are in the judgment, we pass through the judgment, and we go into mercy. To show you, yes, give me 1 second. To show you that, let's go into the book of Jeremiah, okay, chapter 1, where Jeremiah gets his call. In the book of Jeremiah, we're looking for verse 10. I thought so, but I just wanted to verify. In Jeremiah verse 10, 9 and 10, God calls Jeremiah, says, "Then the Lord put on his hand and touched my mouth, and the Lord said to me, Behold, I have put my words in your mouth. Now, I set you this day over nations and over kingdoms to do what?" He comes up with 6 verbs. What the verbs are: to pluck up, to break down, to destroy, to overthrow, to build, and to plant. So out of 6 verbs, 4 are destructive, and only 2 at the end are constructive. Okay? So going through that, we understand that the judgment of God fell fully, but, like in parentheses, almost fully on Jerusalem. But then it was substituted with mercy. Okay? Yes?
I don't want to go backwards, but I have to let you continue. In my introductions and Lamentations and Jeremiah, those Lamentations were 7 years into the writings of Jeremiah. And you're saying that's incorrect, right?
I do not really know what they are talking about, so I will not.
That's what they, in the study Bible, it says the date was 587 BC. Or
587 BC is the day of destruction of Jerusalem, yes.
Right, and then in Jeremiah, and I'm getting to it, it says it's from 628 to 580.
Sure, I did not say that the Lamentations were at the very end of Jeremiah's life, but the reason is, after destruction of Jerusalem, he was actually almost by force. He was taken into Egypt. And he lived in Egypt for a while, and we know about that. Yes?
Well, I don't mean to be nitpicky, but I think you said that Lamentations was written sometime after
Of what?
Jeremiah, right?
No. No. There are people who believe that it was not written by Jeremiah, and it was written like way, way after.
Okay.
But even Dave 580 would not satisfy them. They would believe something like 300.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, good question. So it's important to clarify that. Okay, going back. So that's at least an attempt to explain the structure of the book. Now, we have basically two important themes, and they are pretty obvious. One of them is the destruction of Jerusalem as a whole. And Jeremiah, depicts Jerusalem in different ways. He talks about, as we saw in the very beginning, he depicts it as a city, as a whole, as a community in that city, as a widow, and therefore there is relationship with God and his bride, or that widow who does not have a proper relationship with her husband because of the death of the relationship. She's not a widow because her husband died, but because relationships are dead. And also, she was too much interconnected with other false lovers. And we have this theme picked up in chapter 2, for example. We have leaders, elders, priests, and those who should have been like shepherds of the community. They are destroyed. We have destruction of the festive times and so on and so forth. So on one hand, we have a destruction of, again, the temple and all that is in association with the temple. On the other hand, slowly but surely we have this theme picking up that God is faithful to his people actually in the midst of their unfaithfulness, or regardless of their unfaithfulness. If we'll go just for a second to the back side, the second page, the memory verse you probably all know, and you have been, you've heard about that so many times. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Okay? That's why when we have a hymn, 809, great is thy faithfulness. And it's kind of like a really cool, great is thy faithfulness, God of our, yeah. We need to understand that this is the middle of chapter 3. We are in the middle of destruction mood. Jeremiah comes up with the words of faithfulness of God in the midst of destruction of the temple. So, I like the hymn, but sometimes when we think about that, the tunes that we have in the hymnal are somewhat, misleading, because theoretically it should have been something in a very low minor key, and then with the hope in the middle that kind of reflects that when we go through the crises in our lives, and we go through the crises because of our unfaithfulness. It's not because that God is angry and just for his own fun or, any on his reasons, he dumps on us, a bunch of troubles. No, when we go through the crises because of our unfaithfulness, he is still faithful. His mercies really great, renew every morning. And that's an important theme for this particular book. Now, we need to understand that these 5 chapters are very closely connected with other parts of the Bible. Of course, first and foremost, it is connected with the book of Jeremiah. And as I told you, Jeremiah has been preaching for about 50 years with variety of words. He was preaching basically the very same theme. You have to be faithful to God. You need to be faithful to God. Otherwise, everything will be destroyed. And it's presented in the sense of the worship and in the sense of relationship with other people. But very important, what we need to understand is this interconnection of, we talk about this very often. Vertical relationship with God, with horizontal relationship with other people. It's first and foremost realized in the temple, like we have it in the church. When we, on one hand, we worship God in the way that every one of us experience. Some of us prefer this kind of hymn, some of us prefer this kind of tunes, and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, we are brought together at the altar rail. Same thing was in the temple. But when the temple of the Lord was turned into an idol, then basically God had no choice but to remove that idol. So for example, in Jeremiah chapter 7, if you'll go with me for a second. The passage that I kind of wrote, it's a lengthy one. But let's look at the verse 4. Or, 3 and 4. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel. Okay, first of all, the Lord of hosts is the Lord of armies. And that's whom, now one more thing. About 150 years before, Isaiah saw. Okay? That's what he sees. So when we think about the Lord of hosts, that's the vision of God who is in the Holy of Holies. So the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel says, amend your ways and your deeds, and I will let you dwell in this place. Do not trust in these deceptive words. What are the words? Not go after the idols, not go this, not do this. What are deceptive words? The words are, this is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. What's deceptive about that? What's bad about temple of the Lord?
Idols.
Because the temple of the Lord was turned into an idol itself. They believed, that as long as they have the building, God will be on their side. While they should have thought in the reversed order. Because they are faithful to God, He will complete His promises to meet with them in the temple. Okay? You understand the difference? So we can control God by having temple. Not we are submissive to God and therefore He promises to us to meet in the temple. Okay? Same thing with us. In the good old Luther days, people were so sure that God is present in the Holy Eucharist, in communion, that they would take the host, put it in their mouth, priest will pass, they will put it out, and because it's Christ's presence, they would nail it to the frame of the doors to keep the evil spirits away from the house. Okay? So with the presence of God, I can control the presence of evil spirits in the house. Okay? That's not how it works. He promised to us that He will be with us in the bread and the wine. And therefore, we come to the church and we commune. But again, we cannot use nothing in the church to control God. He actually come to the church because He promised to us. Okay? So that's an important thing. Yes, Charlie?
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
The temple was built under
Solomon.
Strict dimensions and all that. And so the Holy of Holies,
Yes.
God promised that He would be in the Holy of Holies. Right?
Yes.
And so people would naturally gravitate to the temple and get as close as they could to the Holy of Holies, right?
Okay. With the level of, with the grades of being admitted to, yes, because we have priests and Levites is we have a high priest, we have priests and Levites, and then we have laity. Okay, yes.
So,
but so far so good. Yes. What's the question?
How do we look at that as idol worship, or why did God look at it as idol worship when everybody believed that He was there?
The idol worship is reflected in two facts, actually. Thing number one is they trusted in the building, not in the promise. For them, the place was the thing that determined God's presence, not the promise that determined that He will be in this place. Okay? That's thing number one. Second thing, we are going to talk about this next week in more full terms. But in the book of Ezekiel, we see that actually even worshiping in the temple, they had idols in their hearts. In the book of Ezekiel, chapters 8 through 11, the Ezekiel in the vision is brought to the presence of those who should lead the worship. And God says, look at the walls. And the walls they are pictured like the walls of the temple, but they are walls in their heart, in their mind, okay, how they worship. What do you see, Ezekiel? Oh, I see a bunch of creeping things. Okay, who had creeping things on the walls? Egyptians. Okay? So they turned to Egypt for more impact and influence than to God Himself. And there is another thing is when He comes to, in that vision, He comes, to the temple, He is able to crawl through the wall. Kind of like, go through. When can you crawl through the wooden wall? When the wall is rotten. Okay? So it's not a strong building. It's not the building that holds, is a stronghold of faith. Let's put it this way. It's a rotten thing from inside. And we need to remember. So you kind of forced me to do it, so it's your fault.
I'm sorry.
What happens is, okay, one more time. This is roughly 30 AD. Okay, we are somewhere here, 587. About 1,000 years, we have a temple. Okay, and 1445 BC, of course, and it's all BC. We have Exodus. What happened right after Exodus is, so they go through the Red Sea, they have their challenge with manna, somehow they reach Sinai, they have 10 commandments, then Moses and elders go up halfway on the mountain and have a feast with God. That's Exodus chapter 24. Okay? What happens after that? From 25 to 31, chapters 25 to 31, we have 7 speeches of God that are delivered to Moses, how to build the tabernacle. And then he goes down. He comes down in 32. What do we find in chapter 32?
The golden calf.
Gold calf, exactly. So while he is receiving the blueprint of true worship, they ended up in this hanky-panky with that thing, I mean, literally, when Paul refers to that and said, oh, and they sat down and played and, what was that? Sang and played. Okay, they were not playing chess. They were like really doing some goofy stuff that we'd not even want to know, okay? Like really, whatever, bad, okay? So that's golden calf. What happens with the presence of God in the camp? He leaves. No, he doesn't just disappears. Wow. He moves out, okay? So we have a story of moving out here. Okay? Now, somehow Moses restores the relationship, they're in, then God comes in the, in his presence to the tabernacle. They go through the wilderness. They spend 40 years in the wilderness. Actually useless, but that's a different story. We are in the period of Judges, and period of Judges ends up with what? The period of Judges ends up with the rule of Samuel, and under the rule of Samuel in the book of, it's 1 Samuel 4. What happens? He was an adopted kid in the family of Eli, the high priest. He had two older adopted brothers, Ophni and Phinehas. What did these guys do? They perverted worship to such an extent when they brought Ark of the Covenant to the battlefield with Philistines. Ark of the Covenant decided to go to exile instead of staying with Israel and give the victory to Israel. And we know that the Ark of the Covenant is moving basically by itself by the way how Philistines brought it back to Israel. Okay? So again, we have another, so it's the second time when God moves out. Okay? So what happened here is, again, God moves out. Okay? That's so simple. He preferred to be out with those who were exilers in Babylonian captivity that began actually before that date, like about 15, 20 years before, with people like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, with Ezekiel and the whole community over there. Okay? So, unfortunately, we've talked about this quite a number of times. Humans are capable to pervert any gift of God into an idol. Really. Church, communion, baptism, Bible, let alone some semi-neutral stuff, like money, relationship, and so on and so forth. Okay? It doesn't have, money is not bad. It's a good, I like them. I don't worship them, but I kind of like them. I'm not into poverty, what's the thing? Starvation. Or starvation, vow, I didn't, I'm not obligated to be poor, but I'm not going to worship money. That's a different story. But, as I say, even those neutral things, let alone them, even the good stuff, people unfortunately are capable. And we know it why. We know it from a very simple fact. What happened in Genesis 3? If we believe that God created the heavens and the earth, and at the very end of the sixth day, the judgment, or actually evaluation verdict is pronounced, everything was very good.
Then.
Now, my question is, was tree of knowledge of good and evil in the garden by the end of day 6? Yes, it was. So that means that the tree of knowledge of good and evil is a very good creation of God. Were Adam and his wife able to pervert it and misuse it? Sure they could.
Why not?
Yeah, okay. So now, all of us, in the same track. That's why we have Jesus. And that's why it is important to see those parallels. So when Jesus finally leaves, and it's so obvious in the Gospel of Matthew, in Matthew 23 to 25, he tells many things, what will happen if they will reject him. And at the very end of 25, he leaves. And it's like, okay, your house is empty. I'm leaving out. And where he is living, he goes outside of the city on the cross, and that's what the writer of letter to Hebrews, especially in chapter 13, picks up. Let us go with him outside of the city. So he goes outside. He is moving out of the city. He is getting outside. He is on the cross. He is buried outside. And then he gloriously, in resurrected form, shows up again. Okay? So when we read, we kind of need to go to conclusion, which is cool. So in relevance of the book, and we'll come back to Lutheran teaching in a second. In the relevance of the book, I wrote that the book of Lamentations is an important part of canon. So, because on one hand, we remember about God's love and mercy, but we need to understand the reasons for his mercy. And the reasons for him to act merciful is unfaithfulness, infidelity of the people. And as the people of old were punished, we can expect punishment of some grandiose magnitude if a nation is not going to submit to Christ's rule. Is it good news? Yeah, but it doesn't mean it's joyful news. It's a sad news. If the nation is going to be on decline, God will come and clear it and clean it, one way or another. And it's not going to be, maybe it's not going to be joyful. But at the very same time, we can understand that God will carry his faithful community of believers through any turmoil. So when we are going through the storms and attacks of the zeitgeist, that the spirit of time, whatever that time brings, that he is faithful, and we can rely on this faithfulness because the world and creation is sustained by his love and power, not by ours. We can participate in this creative story, but it's not dependent on us. It's dependent more on him. Okay? One final thing. The book of Lamentations is not kind of quoted, is not referred to in the book of Concord. Okay? We've talked about the book of Concord in the first worship service, and I will talk at the second. So it's our confessional documents. We've talked about this last time. Okay? But two main themes of God's faithfulness on one hand, and he is that this love is a foundation for all his actions are present in our teaching. The explanation for the first article of faith, I believe in God, Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. What does that mean? And it's very interesting that Luther goes into, I believe that the God created all things, but he also gave it to me. He gives to me my body and soul, my eyes and ears and all the members. And then he provides for me food and clothing, house and family and wife and children and so on and so forth. And then he ends. He does it out of his fatherly love. And we can see the reflection of this fatherly love in the faithfulness that is given or described to us in the book of Lamentations. And of course, this love is not only the one-time act of God's deliverance, but it's always and constantly presented in our lives. Okay? Questions or comments?